Welcome to Voice Rising with Kara Johnstad. Enjoy weekly conversations with leading luminaries, pioneering visionaries, singers, poets, musicians, and sound healers as we explore the profound role our voice plays on the path to self-realization and global enlightenment. The internationally acclaimed singer, composer, author, healer, recording artist, voice expert, creator of Voice Your Essence, and founder of the School of Voice, Kara Johnstad uses her extraordinary spiritual gifts to empower others. Everything in this world vibrates. Everything has a frequency. A pioneer in the field of voice work and transformational songwriting. Her breakthrough methods are helping thousands of people worldwide fine-tune their body-mind-spirit system and unlock the energetic frequencies of limitless creativity, health, and abundance. Share your voice, ask your questions, join in the conversation. Receive life-changing, positive transformation and rise together to create a sound world. And here's your host, Kara Johnstad.
So welcome, Sharon Blackie, to Voice Rising. I'm delighted to have you join me today to explore the wisdom and magic of your latest book, Wise Women. Your insights into the transformative power of stories will inspire our listeners. And shall we dive straight in?
Sure. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Gorgeous. So your book, Wise Women, Myths and Stories for Midlife and Beyond, delves into European folklore. What inspired you to explore these stories, and how did they guide your search for narratives about older women?
Well, I began the book kind of as a follow-up to my book, Haggitude, which I think we might have spoken about. And Haggitude, I began writing that about 6 years ago. And Haggitude, I was looking to challenge the narrative around older women. And instead of accepting that cultural mythology that tells us we should be silent, we have nothing to say, we have no purpose, and no role models that the culture really offers us for elderhood in women, I decided to find my role models in some of the old stories and the old myths. But Haggitude was really looking at kind of the archetypal qualities of those older women, and I didn't have room in that book to tell the stories in full. So in Wise Women, I wanted to take those stories that I had discovered while I was researching for Haggitude, do some research to see if I could find a few more, and then kind of retell the stories to take out all of the archaic language and offer at the end of each story a little commentary about what they might have to offer us today. So it's been quite a long research project with the aim of kind of rehabilitating the image, I guess, of older women in the culture, but also of giving us some kind of inspiration to believe that we can live differently. And what I loved about the research I did is that there are maybe 32 stories. There are also other types of folklore, but maybe 32 stories in Wise Women. And every one of them offers a different way of being a wise woman, a different way of being older.
Yeah, a different way of being wise. It is nice to have books that are embracing this time, which I find highly creative and very inspirational. Maybe you can remember the story. You talk about someone who's very funny and feisty. So what is your experience with getting funnier or getting feistier or getting wilder?
Both, definitely feistier. I'd like to think that the funny comes with it sometimes, but most days I don't really care, I think it is kind of interesting. I mean, in that selection of stories, there are some lovely older women. There are kind and simple. I don't mean in a kind of foolish way, but just older women who just get on with the really good stuff in their lives, and that's beautiful. But there are also some older women who do not believe that being nice is their life goal anymore. And I like them too, because I think, by the time we get to midlife, and certainly by the time we reach menopause, we've taken a lot of stuff, women, generally speaking, and in whatever way we will have done it, we'll have spent decades probably caring for other people, trying to conform to this image that the culture has of a nice woman, be a good girl, all of those things. And I think when it comes to perimenopause and all of the hormones, the estrogen, particularly the hormones that keep us empathic that keep us nurturing, they're going. And I think that really strong instinct that we have to be nurturing to everybody is also going. And it doesn't mean that in contrast, you become unkind. It just means, I think, that you don't have time for fools anymore. And what you want to reward are the behaviors and the morals and the kind of ideas, the ways of being in the world, which are going to be useful and constructive rather than the ones that are just, time wasting. So I think that's, for me, that kind of feistiness is very, very much present. I spent most of my life being nice. That's what I was told I must be. And I still am. But I won't hesitate. I will not hesitate if I think someone is trying to to treat me badly.
Yeah, it's good. Fairy tales often depict the older women as mean old witches. Either they're invisible and they have nothing to say, or they're ugly and mean and horrible. So how does Wise Woman challenge these traditional portrayals?
By finding 32 stories where that's not what they are, I think, ultimately. I've done the experiment too. If you ask women, which older women do you remember in fairy tales? It's always a wicked witch. It'll be the witch in Rapunzel, who keeps up in the tower, or the witch in Hansel and Gretel who wants to eat them. It will be that kind of devouring older women. And clearly there are some. But it's interesting to me why they get such attention when there are all of these other wonderful, funny, feisty, simple, kind older women who are
brilliant.
Brilliant, yes, who are really, although they're not always the protagonists of the story, they're not always the main character. Sometimes they are, but not always. Nevertheless, they are the ones that kind of hold the story in the palm of their hands.
Yes.
Are the ones that see the big picture of the story, that know what has to be done for the heroine to succeed in whatever it is that she is trying to become. And that kind of big picture overview, the ones who pull the strings, the ones who weave the stories, is really scattered throughout European myth and folklore. I mean, there were 32 stories in that book as of when I handed it in to my editor, which would have been January this year. Since then, I found another half dozen, with different older women again. And of course, I was restricted by, in most cases, not all, but in most cases, by stories in English translation. And, there must be many, many more that I just didn't have the language skills, apart from anything else, to uncover.
Yeah. Do you think certain parts of the world have different myths or folklores with different archetypes? Or do you think generally we all have collective archetypes that are very similar?
Honest, I don't really know, because I have very much specialized in my own folklore and mythology, because I know it. I know the land it comes from. I know how to interpret it. I won't get it wrong and offend an entire culture because I've taken a particular image in the wrong way. So I'm quite strong about that. But to the extent that I know, say, we're from friends in the Native American traditions, or to some extent in some of the Eastern traditions, they also have very wonderful elder women. I think what was interesting to me, and again, I am absolutely restricted to stories in translation, is it was very much easier to find feisty older women in Northern European mythology as opposed to kind of Southern European and Mediterranean folklore. That seemed a little bit harder on its older women, but it's not.
Must be the weather, Sharon.
You think that's what it is?
The bitter cold.
In the cold, yeah, absolutely.
If you can survive the northern winds, you have to be a little bit feisty.
Maybe that's it.
Yeah, it is fascinating. I guess I loved reading the fairy tales. And when you were talking about the princess kind of heroine, and that the older women are more the witches from Hansel and Gretel, or even Snow White, I was thinking when I was reading stories to my daughter that almost all the stories that I was reading, the mother has always died. Like Cinderella's mother had died and she ends up with an evil stepmother. Or Little Red Riding Hood, maybe she has a mother who hands her the basket, but the mothers are somehow non-existent. The older women are somehow ugly. And then there's going to be a handsome prince on a white horse that comes and saves us.
You know,
have
that's
right.
actually quite rare. That saving by the prince, the saving of the heroine by the prince is rare. It is almost all Disney and a handful of stories. Clearly, there are stories where that's what happens. But if you look at fairy tale heroines, they are very much more likely to save their husband or the man who's going to be their husband, or to save their sisters. Lots of stories where they save their sisters from giants or whatever, you know, including there's a beautiful story from Orkney Islands where a princess saves her two sisters who've been skinned by a giant, and she puts the skins back on them and brings them back to life. So there are lots and lots of stories where the princess is the one who does the saving. You know, think of the Norwegian story, kind of east of the sun, west of the moon, where, you know, she saves her husband who's been turned into a bear by a wicked woman. So I think the narrative is, I don't really understand always where it comes from. You know, that it's mostly about insipid princesses. I mean, certainly some of it comes from Disney. Some of it comes from the stories that Charles Perrault, for example, from the French, who wrote a kind of saccharine version of The Sleeping Beauty and so on. They kind of made the stories what they thought were more acceptable to the systems of the age. But really, it's not like that when you actually do the, you know, when you actually
do the research.
Yeah.
Yeah, you do have the real or a much older version of Little Red Riding Hood.
A wonderful one where the granny is actually the one who saves her from the wolf. Yeah. Lots of different versions of these stories. And it's interesting, again, the ones that we get told. So curiously, you know, the one of the earliest versions of The Sleeping Beauty, the prince actually rapes her while she's in her sleep. And she wakes up and she's got two babies suckling at her breast. And it's just like, what happened? Oh, yeah.
Wow.
You know, so a lot of this stuff is sanitized. And some of the original versions are actually really punchy and really very powerful and have very much more interesting characters. That princess doesn't take any prisoners, you know, when she wakes up. I mean, she marries the prince in the end, but boy, she tests him first and gives him a hard time.
Wow, that's powerful. I just got inspired to ask your publisher to do a sister fairy tales. And my sister, she loves to send me fairy tales and myths. And I was thinking, oh, now we have the elderly women, but if we could get some sister stories in there, I'd be the next one to buy the next book. But I know you have many, many books on the list. So that was just an inspirational moment with all your research that you've done. Suddenly I was thinking, oh, wow, sisters.
Sisters, yeah. Because, you know, again, if you say sisters, everybody remembers the wicked stepsisters. But they're stepsisters. And again, there are all of these stories of young heroines who save their sisters and who go on quests to help their sisters. So there is a great sisterhood theme in many stories, but these again tend to be the fairy tales that we don't know very much. It's a little bit like the mothers. So yes, you're right that the mothers are often vanished. You know, the good mother, as we might think of it, is dead and she's replaced by the bad mother, who is the wicked stepmother. But we also have some birth mothers who are bad and abusive, or who are just seem to be powerless, you know, to stop their husbands from abusing their daughters in various ways. So there's a whole spectrum of different types of fairy tale mothers, but we only really know the dead ones and the wicked ones.
Abusive mothers is also very harsh. Are there fairy tales about good mothers?
Yes, there are. Well,
healthy children and...
Oh, sure. I mean, Red Riding Hood is a good mother. She's trying to get her daughter to grow up, you know, and there are a couple of other stories, the various versions. One of the original Grimm's versions of Snow White, which is Snow White and Rose Red. I mean, the mother of two twins, I think they're twin daughters or sisters anyway. You know, she invites a bear into the house. She saves a bear. So that's that's a good mother and a fairly serious mother as well. So you can find any type of story if you go looking. And, you know, I am passionate, as you can tell, about fairy tales, and that's for sure those different ways in which fairy tales can illuminate our path through life, not just the second half of life, which I've been focusing on recently, but also the first half of life seems to me to be infinite.
Tell me the difference between myths, fairy tales, folk tales, and then, of course, you have also in your book ballads. You have a few narratives and songs. So how would you explain to somebody like me, what is the difference between a myth and a folktale or a fairy tale?
Well, I would draw the categories to begin with, myth and folk tales.
Mm-hmm.
Has a different function, basically. Myth is kind of a religious, let's call it a religious explicatory kind of function. It tells you how the world came to be and what your place in it is in a kind of cosmological sense.
Mm-hmm.
So myth is trying to explain big picture stuff, whereas folklore, by kind of definition, are the stories and the ballads and the rhymes and the dances of the people. So they have a way, they kind of explain how everyday life is and how our relationships are and our relationship with the world around us and the particular challenges that normal humans face. So folk tales clearly are a subset of folklore, which includes dance and song and what have you. Fairy tales are a subset of folk tales, and they are the ones that take place in a kind of magical world, where magic is quite common. So that's really what it is. But the reason why I love fairy tales actually more than myth, I mean, I have studied both intensively, but I love fairy tales more than myth because myth can sometimes be a bit difficult to live up to, the characters in it, because they're big, they're powerful, they're gods or goddesses or great heroes or whatever. And fairy tales, even a princess, I mean, you can call a character in a fairy tale princess, but, she's behaving just like we do. That's just to make the story pretty and entertaining. And so that's really why I love them. They're about our everyday situations, even if they're set in a magical world.
The reason I started reading your book, I mean, it was If Women Rose Rooted, that profoundly changed me as a woman. I get tears in my eyes because it was really beautiful. I come from the North. I think as an American, I had lost my roots in many ways. We are identifying with the long thread of our ancestors, but we still are not in those lands anymore. So somehow, like everybody has many times migrated and moved. But it was interesting for me when I started reading other stories and realizing that my DNA lines are Orkney Islands and Ireland and Scotland and Norway and Sweden. So that's basically, that mythology. I didn't know anything. And everything I was learning in school was the Greek mythology. And so I felt so much gratitude that someone is preserving a lot of these fairy tales that are from this part of the world, because I feel that a lot of them have been lost.
Yeah, I mean, because they were really presented to us in different ways. I had the same thing. When you study Greek and even Roman mythology, it's like it's okay. They are a belief system. Whereas to the extent that we were told these stories, they were for entertainment. And it's just like, well, why do the Greeks get to call it, cosmology, effectively, a whole belief system? And we just have to talk about it in the context of entertaining stories for, around the fire or for kids or whatever. So that really struck me when I was living in America. And I wrote about this in If Women Rose Rooted. I lived in America for 6 years, and it was a very, the whole 6 years was a long midlife crisis, really. And I was looking at Native American writers like, Joy Harjo and Leslie Marmon and all of those wonderful women who could see strong women in their own stories, their own mythology. And I thought to myself, I wish we had them. And then I thought, well, do we? And I went off looking, and we did. And it enraged me that women were not told these stories, that women were not made aware of them. And to the extent that they were just kind of passed off as superstitions or fireside tales. They were cosmologies. They were the way the world was. And in Northern European traditions, I know less about the south of Europe, in Northern European traditions, in the Nordic traditions, as well as in the kind of Irish and the Anglo-Saxon traditions, to the extent that we still have records of them, women were very powerful in that mythology. They were the moral authority of the other world, and they were the land as well. So they were the land and the other world that's entangled with it. Women, not men. No, not some great bearded guy in the sky. These were women here with these otherworldly powers that kind of kept the show on the road and literally wove the world into being. Why don't we know about them? And then I thought, okay, well, maybe that's my job.
It definitely is a calling. I think it's the book of enchantment, where you talk about the tradition of naming things in nature. Like instead of saying the tree, say, oh, old Henry, or the mountain becomes this beautiful woman. And it just gives us such a deep connection. I often think that we would not be in the climate crisis and the ecological crisis if we had that connection of story, of naming things, of giving our favorite tree a name. We just walk by these things. We just walk by. There's very little connection anymore to our environment. And what one senses in these stories is the honoring of the land, the deep roots that women have to the land. There's a beautiful story in Wise Women where she's making something called crowdy, and that's where the world is born, I believe, right? She's this elderly woman.
Dreams come from.
Yeah, where dreams come from. And I was assuming crowdy is like cottage cheese.
It is kind of a cottage. Yeah.
Or like curds or...
Yeah, it's the basic, it's the simplest form of cheese. And she's creating the world's dreams from cheese, from a cave in the mountains, an old woman. And actually she has a husband who helps her with this, which is kind of unusual in some of these older women stories. But yes, I think, for me, that is all about relationship, that whole idea that you talk to the crow that's in your garden every morning. And you might think it's silly at first if you're not used to doing that, but it soon stops being silly because, the crow is going to look at you and you just have this sense you don't need words to converse with a crow. It's just as well because they don't speak them, but you're still in relationship. Yeah. If you acknowledge it every time you walk by, just like you would acknowledge a neighbor if you walk down the street. And that's all, I think it's as simple as that to me, shifting our relationship with the natural world, our sense of belonging to the natural world is just to be in relationship with everything. I tell the trees that have got berries on them how beautiful they are, just like people talk to their houseplants sometimes and say that they thrive. Why wouldn't they? I think the world is built on relationship and we have cut ourselves off from relationship with the land. And as soon as you put yourself into relationship with it, all kinds of wonderful things happen. I look for stories everywhere I go, I'm looking for a stone that looks like an old woman. I'm looking for the hill in front of us where we live at the moment. There's a lot of giant folklore, it's a very looming kind of hill. So there's a giant that lives up there. I mean, you can say that that's silly, and I'm sure some people do. But when I look up at that hill every morning, I say hello to the giant, and it just adds a kind of imaginal layer onto a very beautiful physical object. And it just reels me in. It makes me feel part of a story as opposed to some human being looking at something very objectively. I'm kind of bringing it inside me,
It is fascinating that we are walking in the same place, on the same footsteps, not only of the deer and the bear and the ducks, but generations of people. I'm just blown away that all the bones, they stay for hundreds of years. And we continue layers upon layers of stories.
Yes, and that's why I think and that's why I think these stories are important. They're important for so many reasons, right? But they're important because they connect us to that sense of lineage. And they connect us. And it's not that I'm suggesting that our ancestors were super wise, that there was some grand golden age that we've lost, because I don't think that was always true. But they certainly knew some things that we have forgotten, just as we've learnt some things that they didn't know. And I think the ideal world is one where we kind of, we find a way of balancing the two. But that sense of being part of a lineage in the land, I mean, whoever you are and however you came to a land, that sense of there being a lineage, a kind of a layered history of story and image and archetype, I think is really very important. That's what these stories do for us, They take us back.
It's so endearing, this idea of lineage, because in this moment, many of us are told, let it go, let it go, let it go. We need to be in the power of now, in the present moment. And although this is good to be present in the moment, I find it a very important work to integrate it. That's what has touched me so much about your work, to weave in the stories, to weave in that bad relationship. We carry these stories in our memory and in our bones. It can be very empowering to use the stories to have the lineage and also to integrate so that you can move on in a very imaginal or empowering way.
Yeah, I mean, we can't live in the present moment. We're not built like that. We're narrative creatures. We literally are hardwired for narrative. That's how our brains work. So yes, it is important to be alive in the present moment. But the whole idea that you can escape narrative, that you can escape the past and the future is delusional, I think, if you'll forgive me for being blunt about it, because, we perceive the world in a temporal fashion, and our brains are designed to see the world in a temporal fashion. We create stories about everything that happens to us in our day. We create stories of our identity. They are, of course, selective because that's what stories are. But that's what we do. We're storytelling animals. And I think any attempt to push that to one side is only going to be destructive because it's not recognizing how we are, who we are as humans. And I think these old stories really do illuminate different ways of being in the world that we have lost and that we could very usefully use again. So I'm very passionate about story for that reason.
How is storytelling important for our own transformation? Let's say somebody is struggling with midlife, they're totally a wreck. Or take your own situation of being in America and knowing that you needed a shift or a change. How did listening to different narratives or realizing that there are other stories out there change something?
I mean, basically just to say that, as a psychologist, I worked with story in my psychotherapeutic practice and used to teach narrative ways of working of therapy. And the reason for that is because there's never just one story to tell about any series of events. We tend to think that there is, but there isn't. And it's entirely possible to see yourself, if I just put it in really obvious terms, see yourself as a victim in a particular situation, or you can see yourself as someone who's in a really bad situation, but has the possibility of transforming it. And I think that's what fairy tales do particularly well, because every fairy tale heroine begins with a lack or begins in a really difficult situation where their life is threatened. And by the end of it, they have found a way out, always through community, often with the help of a wise old woman. But that fairy tale heroine, by the end of the story, will see herself as something quite different. So it's about never just thinking that there is one story that fits a particular set of events. And it's holding in your heart the belief that any story can be transformed. Any story can be changed. And then what we're looking for is clues. How do I do that? And fairy tales tell us how, in big picture terms, how we do that. We do that by creating community. We do that by respecting the wisdom of the birds. We do that by listening to the wise old woman. We do it by doing the work. We do it by putting the years in, the apprenticeships in. There are qualities that heroines have in fairy tales that are kind of put to us as, really, really big, useful life skills.
That is true. The people are putting in their hours. They're spinning and spinning and spinning to make their clothing. And we're in the day and age of everything being quick and fast.
Yeah, one of my favorite stories in the world is a Scottish story, though there are various versions of it around Europe. It's called The Black Bull of Nodaway. And it's about basically a young girl whose husband is a black bull because he's been enchanted. And she loses him. She makes a mistake and she loses him. And she goes on a quest for him, and there's this big glass mountain that's in her way, and she can't cross it because it's a glass mountain. She tries to go up it and she slides on down. She has to apprentice herself to a blacksmith for 7 years before he will make her the shoes that allows her to get traction on that glass mountain. So it's about saying, okay, I haven't got all the skills I need yet. I'm not there yet. I need the 7 years with the blacksmith. Then I'll be able to scale the glass mountain and all that symbolizes for us.
Conscious media for conscious minds. Om Times. Host your show on IOM FM, the radio network of Om Times Media, one of the more recognized brand names in the conscious community, and is backed by the extensive marketing reach of Om Times. Hosting a show on IOM FM immediately connects you with our extensive dedicated community. With happy clients all over the world, Kara Johnstad knows that your voice is the missing link to more authenticity, abundance, creativity, and health. An internationally acclaimed voice expert, Kara's breakthrough methods have helped thousands of people successfully heal their voice wounds and extinguish the story of self-doubt and shyness forever. Join in group trainings, attend online sessions, schedule one-on-one time, and invite Kara to work with your organization and community. Get started today. Go to www.karajohnstad.com and receive a special guided meditation designed to fine-tune your inner voice and welcome you on the voice journey.
This is Kathy Beal, host of Celestial Compass, featuring astrology you can use. Celestial Compass points you to what's going on in the sky and what you can do with it down here on Earth. We also explore fun, effective, and cosmic tools for navigating this adventure we call life. Join me the first and third Monday of the month at 5 p.m. Eastern Time for Celestial Compass. It's enlightening, entertaining, and empowering.
Ascending Hearts is no ordinary dating site, but a spiritual dating site with a purpose, to link you with your soulmate. We engineer the serendipity so you can trust that you will attune with someone that has the same matching vibration as you. Ascending Hearts, the conscious dating site for the spiritually aware. Try Ascending Hearts for free. ascendinghearts.com.
If I could be you,
and you could be me,
for just 1 hour.
If you could find a way
to get inside
each other's mind.
Walk a mile in my shoes.
Walk a mile in my shoes.
Walk a mile in my shoes.
We've all felt left out. And for some, that feeling lasts more than a moment. We can change that. Learn how at belongingbeginswithus.org. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Walk a mile in my shoes.
How do you think modern storytelling can evolve to better represent the experiences of the wise elders or older women?
I think it's important to say first that unlike myth, which tends to be more static, purely because it is about that big kind of worldview, folk tales, and particularly fairy tales, were designed to change over time. So as circumstances changed, as people's lives changed, as the challenges that they face changed and shifted, something very acute might come in, like a famine, or something might ease up. And the stories were designed to shift with the times. They were never designed to be written down and kind of be static. And I think we have lost that sense today of shifting stories. And so we do have a tendency, I think, here in the West, to think that if a story has been written down in a book, it's the true story. And I think that, some of that is biblical in a way, literally, the Bible was written down and that's it. That's the end. You can't change it. It's the truth. But folktales are not like that. And so we've kind of done ourselves a bit of a disservice by writing them down, even though it's protected them and made them available to us. And so I think it's always really important when we're looking at an old story to appreciate the wisdom, that it gave to our ancestors at the time, but also to think about, well, times have changed, perhaps. The world has shifted. How would this story change? As an example, I wrote a collection of reimagined fairy tales. It's called Foxfire Wolfskin and Other Stories of Shape-Shifting Women. And in that collection, I looked at some common fairy tales, common to me, and folk tales that I had lived with. And I thought to myself, what if the women in them came to us today? What would they say? What would their voices be? So as an example, one of them was the Snow Queen. Does the Snow Queen look like in an age of global warming? Could she be a heroine, rather than the villain, for example? So it's just kind of looking at exploring. And of course, a lot of writers have done this well before me. Angela Carter, who is a well-known British writer who reimagined Little Red Riding Hood and so many stories for a feminist world, to give more emphasis to the women's voices. She wrote the story that ended up becoming the movie, The Company of Wolves, for example. So,
I don't know that.
Yeah, there is a tradition of that even today. And of course, we do it in more literary sense. We do it on the page because we've lost a lot of the habit of oral storytelling. But I think it is happening. And I think it's really important to do it in an authentic way, but just to say, okay, we don't have these roles anymore. Times have shifted. What would this story look like if it arose in today's world?
What is important to you about oral storytelling? Because while I was reading your book, Wise Women, I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to sit at a fireplace somewhere or around a fire and share these stories out loud? And the way they're written is in a very, it's very easy to read them. So I felt like you supported the language to make it easier to read out loud.
Yeah, that was part of the point. So when I conceived of Wise Women, I wanted to do something different from what I did in Foxfire Wolfskin, which was a very literary kind of collection. I wanted the stories to be told as well as to be read, because I think that is really important. It's another way of keeping them alive, because not everybody reads books, you know, and they can be very much more vivid. They can be made very much more vivid if you're actually telling them. And so there was an effort still to make the language beautiful. That's always what I'm going to do as a writer, but just to make them a little bit more vivid, you know, to keep that, to try to bring some of the vividness of the oral tellings into something that is on the page. So, as you say, not to make them too complicated and not to make the characters too complicated or the settings too complicated, but to kind of rely on, as much as anything else, to rely on what happens. And you know, years ago when I lived in a particular part of Ireland where there were a lot of poets and artists and musicians, we used to have a thing when if somebody came for a glass of wine or if somebody came for dinner or whatever, you know, we'd kind of ask them to sing for their supper, quite literally. So, you know, if they were a musician, then they might sing a song, or the poet might say a poem. I would tell a story, a little one, not going on forever. It was kind of like a kind of modern day reinvention of the old Ceilidh idea. And it was very powerful because you would tell a story and then everybody around the table would talk about it. Oh, I remember a story like this from when I was a kid, or isn't it amazing, that story, because she did this? And, you know, and instantly they're alive again. They're not just on the page. Pages are very beautiful. I'm a writer, but, you know, it brings them into your life. And so I think it's so important. I'm not talking about performance storytelling. Mm-hmm. I'm just talking about kind of informal settings and, you know, story circles. A lot of women these days are going back to story circles, you know, where they have a group for the purpose of telling stories to each other. It can be stories about kind of real life, or it can be kind of folk tales and fairy tales that they remember. And it's such an encouraging thing to me that people would want to start telling them again. People get very nervous about it, but it's not performance storytelling. It's about sharing a story, and it's much more easily done, I think, than people understand.
I love that. I don't think it's come yet to Berlin, but I will check it out. Story circles. I know book clubs, and there's also writing groups with creative writing where everyone's reading their stories at the end, which I always find a little bit challenging because in one way it's beautiful to share, but sometimes when you are writing something, I'm sure you know this place as a writer, if it gets exposed too fast to light, it feels fragile. There are days that it's easy for me to share what I'm writing, and then there are other days where I don't want to share it. It feels good to have it growing somewhere in deep, moist soil under the earth and not exposed too fast.
I would never workshop my writing. My husband, maybe, my agent sometimes, but only when it's really kind of, you know,
already solidified somehow. Exactly. Yeah. There are a few songs written now, like the old ballads, very little about the land. What is your experience with all these beautiful old ballads, and why do you think songwriting has changed so much?
I think in the 20th century and continuing into the 21st century, we have just become obsessed with the inside of our own heads, if I could put it that way. We've just, you know, we've become uber individualistic, and we just don't see the world in any other way. And I think that obsession with our own process, whatever that may be, although of course it's very good to understand who you are and to work through issues and wounds and all of the rest of it, I think it's unfortunately made us forget that we are in a more than human world. And so we're so obsessed with our own particular emotions and, you know, what happens to us that we don't have the ability, I don't think, to see that bigger picture anymore. And again, one of the reasons why I think this kind of folk revival, and there is a bit of a folk revival going on. It's not just with fairy tales. It's not just with music. Writers are inserting folk folkloric tropes into their novels and short stories and what have you. I think I think people are beginning to recognize that, and it might be, I hope it's the sign of a kind of swing back to something a little bit less egocentric and a little bit less human-centric for sure.
In the time of AI, people want to return to a kind of humanity where people are connected again to this human quality. You said that a few moments ago. Do we have a way of navigating through the story to use what we have intelligently and manage to change the narrative?
Yeah, I think it is very much about, as I've said, a human-centric focus and the belief that anything beyond us doesn't really matter. So it's all about relationship. I am a psychologist and neuroscientist by training, so I have a great interest in the human mind and the human brain, the human psyche. But, we don't grow, we don't take a journey to wholeness all by ourselves. Yeah. We are in a world that is full of other beings, not just human, but other beings that also have their own process of becoming. And then, if you look back into our old European traditions, we have this concept of the world as alive, the world as animate, of the anima mundi, the world soul. So, every level that we look at it, there's a process of becoming going on, which is different from us and beyond us. And we have no sense of that anymore. We've just got the me bit, and we've lost, I think, all sense of the other. And I don't think we're going to survive as a species if we don't find a way to bring ourselves back to that understanding of wider relationship in the world.
Do you think that also it has to do with how everything is so individualized? When I was a child, we used to read the same book in the family. We'd, pass it back and forth, or there were only 3 television channels at that time. So if we watched a movie, we literally had to wait 1 year. It came once a year, The Wizard of Oz, and we all waited for that Thursday night, and we all watched it together. So we were somehow in that family structure on the same wavelength as far as which stories were in the room. And now so much of it is everybody's on their phone, following different channels, following different stories. Everybody has their favorite playlist on Netflix or whichever streaming platform people are watching. And everything's so individualized that people don't even share a common story. In your own lifetime, have you experienced that it shifts somehow?
Yeah, and I think also, I do give thanks every day for the fact that I did not grow up in a digital age, because also there were very few stories. Certainly, I grew up in a very poor environment, so I was entirely reliant on libraries, and the books that you read were the books that were in the library. That's what you had, and so you read them. And you read things that you probably otherwise wouldn't have read because that's what there was. And I think we are ruined by an excess of choice, I think. You had to delve very deeply into a story because you didn't know when you were going to get the next book. And so it leads to a focus and a respect for proper narrative and the ways in which it's built and characters are drawn and life happens. I think that we run the risk also of losing today if we're not careful.
Mm-hmm. It's hard. How do you make decisions? I find that hard and challenging. I wish they had only 2 things in the restaurant and not 50.
I react normally with paralysis, I think. And I revert to some strange pre-digital self that didn't like too much choice.
I know you have to leave, and I'm so grateful for your time. You mentioned the need for tales in which we can shine. Can you give us an example from the book Wise Women of a tale which defies these conventional expectations of the evil, mean, ugly, and is a shiny, beautiful elder woman? I'm already an elder. We're elders.
Yeah, there are lots of stories about very powerful older women in there, but one of the ones I found it kind of halfway through the writing, and I was so delighted. And it's just a very simple story about your average older woman who is wandering, a very, very poor old woman who is wandering down the road, and she finds a pot of gold. And she thinks, oh my goodness, that's amazing. A pot of gold. I've been poor all my life. And so she starts to drag it home with her. And at some point she looks behind and, oh, it's a pot of silver. Oh, but that's even better because silver is so much easier to look after than gold. I wouldn't be worried all the time that my neighbors were going to steal it from me. And she goes along a little bit more, and then it's a pot of iron, full of iron, and she's looking at all of the good things about iron. And by the time she gets home, it's turned into a stone. This pot of gold has transformed itself all the way to a stone. And she says, that's just the thing I needed. I really needed something as a doorstop, to prop my front door open. And the whole story is just, she looks on the surface like a foolish old woman, but what that story is basically saying is that what you have is what you need. And it's a kind of antidote to all of the stories that tell us we must always want more. We must always have progress and more of everything. And I just thought it was such a beautiful story because there was this woman that you wanted her for your neighbor. She was exactly the kind of character that you would want in a community. The woman who it's not just being satisfied with your lot in a kind of negative way. It's that ability to make something out of nothing. And that is that creativity that women have, I think, that kind of generative ability that we have. We don't need a pot of gold if we've got a stone. And so I love that story with a passion because to me, she is one of the shiniest characters in the book for that very reason. Just any old woman or any of us can look at the world that way.
Gratitude, right? And it brings us away from this idea that we have to manifest. We have 10 steps to manifesting the golden platinum something to come back to the earthy rootedness of seeing the beauty of a stone.
Exactly. But that is the cultural mythology, isn't it? And it's all tied up with the kind of the myth of the hero that we've grown so attached to. This whole idea that everybody must have more of everything. Every generation must have more than the previous generation. It's the classic capitalist kind of, progress at all costs type of thing. Yeah. And these stories were in a kind of pre-capitalist age. Right. And, we can't go back in some ways, but we can certainly go back in others.
I thank you for being here at Voice Rising with me. Know that your work touches me. Great.
Thank you so much.